At 11:29 in the evening, Eastern Time on August the 18th, a statement landed from the office of Canada's Prime Minister. It did not sound like a victory speech. It did not sound like a surrender either. Mark Carney wrote that substantial progress had been made, though important work still remained. 90 minutes earlier, President Donald Trump had pulled the trigger back on tariffs that were set to detonate at midnight. 50% duties on nearly $20 billion of Canadian goods, timed to hit just as the clock struck 12. For a few hours, an entire slice of the world's largest trading relationship hung on a single phone call and a single social media post. This is the story of how it got to that midnight deadline, and why so many trade lawyers, diplomats, and economists on both sides of the border are calling this the moment Canada finally stopped absorbing the punches and started throwing a few of its own. To understand why that Tuesday night mattered, you have to go back 18 months to a winter morning in Washington when none of this had a name yet. On February the 1st, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order invoking a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It is a 1977 statute, built for sanctions and asset freezes, never once used for tariffs by any president before him. Trump used it anyway, declaring a national emergency over fentanyl trafficking and directing new duties at Canada, Mexico, and China. The justification leaned heavily on the argument that Canada was not doing enough to stop the flow of the drug across its border. But according to data from U.S. Customs and Border Protection, roughly 0.2% of all fentanyl seized entering the United States is caught at the Canadian border. Almost all of it, the remaining 99.8%, is intercepted at the border with Mexico. That gap between the stated reason and the numbers behind it would become a recurring theme in almost every escalation that followed. A month later, on March the 4th, 2025, the first blanket tariff landed, 25% on Canadian goods not covered by the existing North American trade agreement, with a reduced 10% rate on energy products. Ottawa's response was measured at first. Prime Minister Carney, only weeks into the job after replacing Justin Trudeau, described the negotiations publicly as delicate and avoided the kind of inflammatory rhetoric that had defined some of his predecessors' exchanges with the White House. But behind the calm public tone, Canadian officials were already building contingency plans, because Trump had also been musing publicly, repeatedly, about annexing Canada outright as what he called the 51st state. Carney and other Canadian leaders rejected that suggestion flatly and consistently, insisting the two countries functioned better as partners than as one absorbed into the other. By the summer of 2025, the tariff campaign had not slowed down. It had accelerated. On August the 1st, Trump signed another executive order, raising the levy on Canadian imports not covered by the trade agreement from 25% up to 35%. In the letter he sent directly to Carney announcing the increase, Trump again cited fentanyl smuggling as the primary justification, adding a line that read almost like a negotiating tactic in itself, that the tariffs could be modified upward or downward depending on the relationship between the two countries going forward. According to the Office of the United States Trade Representative, in 2024, the U.S. exported nearly $350 billion in goods to Canada and imported more than $412 billion in the other direction, making Canada, even amid all this turbulence, one of America's largest trading partners in either direction. Carney's answer to the 35% hike was not another tariff war. It was a pivot. Canada began actively distancing itself from total reliance on the American market, strengthening trade ties with the European Union and the United Kingdom, and positioning itself publicly as the more reliable economic partner in a world where Washington's terms could shift with a single letter. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, whose province carries the heaviest exposure to American tariffs because of its concentration of auto manufacturing, backed Carney's approach, saying the two governments needed to present a unified front regardless of party lines back home. Then came October, and the episode that, more than any tariff percentage, exposed just how personally Trump was taking this entire dispute. The province of Ontario ran a television advertisement across major American networks. It used edited audio from a 1987 speech by President Ronald Reagan, a Republican icon, a free trade Republican icon specifically, in which Reagan warned that tariffs hurt every American worker and consumer and risked triggering fierce trade wars. The ad was purchased and aired by the Ontario government, not the federal government in Ottawa, but that distinction did not seem to register with the White House. Trump called the ad fake on his social media platform, described it as an egregious hostile act, and posted that all trade negotiations with Canada were, in his words, hereby terminated. The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute weighed in too, saying the ad had lacked context, though it did not dispute that the words used were genuinely Reagan's own. Doug Ford said Ontario would pull the ad the following week, so that trade talks could resume. But the commercial aired anyway during Game 1 of the World Series between the Toronto Blue Jays and the Los Angeles Dodgers, and then again during Game 2. Trump responded from aboard Air Force One en route to Asia, announcing an additional 10% tariff on top of everything already in place, accusing Canada of, in his words, being caught red-handed with a fraudulent advertisement. The ad was finally pulled from rotation the following Monday. Trump's post claimed, without offering evidence, that Canada had run the ad, hoping the U.S. Supreme Court would come to what he called Canada's rescue on the tariff issue. That line, the reference to the Supreme Court, turned out to be more prophetic than anyone expected at the time, because 4 months later, the Supreme Court did rule, and it did not rule the way the White House wanted. On February the 20th, 2026, in a case called Learning Resources versus Trump, the Supreme Court issued a 6-3 decision that struck down the sweeping tariffs Trump had imposed under the Emergency Powers Law, both the fentanyl-related tariffs targeting Canada, Mexico, and China, and the broader reciprocal tariffs applied to nearly every other trading partner. The majority opinion was blunt. The justices wrote that the emergency powers statute contains no reference to tariffs or duties at all, that the government pointed to no statute in which Congress had used the word regulate to authorize taxation, and that, until this administration, no president had ever read that law as conferring the power to impose tariffs in the first place. It was, by any legal measure, a significant rebuke. A 6-3 vote is not a narrow squeaker. It is a broad coalition of justices agreeing that the executive branch had reached well beyond what Congress had actually granted it. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, the ruling reaffirmed the constitutional separation of powers between the legislative and executive branches, and upheld Congress's foundational authority over taxation and tariffs under Article 1 of the Constitution. Practically, the ruling meant Washington had to stop collecting tariffs that had been imposed under that specific legal authority, effective February the 24th, 2026. For a moment, it looked like a genuine turning point, the kind of legal check that could have ended the whole saga. It did not. Within hours of the ruling, Trump signaled he would simply find another legal pathway, and he did. He invoked Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a different statute altogether, and imposed a new 10% global import surcharge, later suggesting on social media it could rise to 15%. Crucially, this new tariff excluded goods compliant with the North American Trade Agreement, which meant the practical sting for most Canadian exporters actually eased for a period. But the underlying appetite in Washington for using tariffs as leverage against Ottawa had clearly not gone anywhere. According to trade law firm Norton Rose Fulbright, because the vast majority of Canadian imports entering the U.S. do qualify as compliant under the trade agreement, the Supreme Court's ruling, while historic on paper, had limited practical benefit for most Canadian exporters, who, by that point, were far more exposed to sector-specific tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, lumber, and automobiles, none of which the ruling had touched. Those sectoral tariffs are worth pausing on, because they're the ones that never went away through any of this. Steel and aluminum imports from any country, including Canada, remained subject to a 50% duty imposed under a completely separate legal authority, Section 232, untouched by the Supreme Court's decision, untouched by the pivot to Section 122, untouched by anything that followed. For an economy where Ontario alone anchors the bulk of Canada's auto manufacturing sector, and where metals producers across the country ship enormous volumes south of the border, these sectoral tariffs were doing quiet, sustained damage even while the headline legal battles played out in Washington courtrooms. Which brings the story to July the 20th, 2026, the moment that set the stage for everything that followed in August, and arguably the moment that earns the description of a final red line. On that day, President Trump signed 3 separate proclamations, invoking a law called Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. According to legal analysis from the law firm Wiley, and confirmed independently by White and Case and by Holland and Knight, this marked the very first time in American history that any president had used Section 338 to impose tariffs. The statute is different from the ones used before it. It authorizes the president to impose new or additional duties on a country he determines is discriminating against American commerce compared to how it treats other trading partners. And unlike the earlier tariffs, these Section 338 duties are not automatically time-limited, and critically, they apply regardless of whether the goods in question are compliant with the North American Trade Agreement. That last detail mattered enormously, because compliance with that agreement had been the safety net protecting the vast majority of Canadian exports through every previous round of this dispute. Section 338 removed that net entirely for the goods it covered. The White House's own fact sheet, published the day the proclamations were signed, laid out the reasoning in 3 specific sectors: motor vehicles, alcoholic beverages, and dairy. On alcohol, the complaint centered on Canadian provincial liquor boards pulling American products from store shelves, a retaliatory move some provinces had taken earlier in the trade war. On autos, the administration pointed to Canadian tariffs and quotas affecting American-made vehicles. On dairy, the argument was that Canada restricts the sale of American dairy products more tightly than it restricts dairy from other trading partners. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the tariffs were scheduled to take effect on August the 19th, 30 days after signing the minimum notice period the statute requires. The scope, once trade lawyers actually dug into the annexes attached to each proclamation, turned out to be far broader than the three headline categories suggested. According to reporting from Thomson Reuters' Tax and Trade Desk, buried in Annex 2 of each proclamation was a list that extended to wine, hockey sticks, cement, plywood, furniture, fishing rods, seeds, clothing, wigs, and swimming pools. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative put the total exposure at nearly $20 billion, which the same analysis calculated as roughly 5.2% of the $382 billion in goods the United States imported from Canada in 2025. It is not, on paper, a number that sounds like it should threaten to unravel an entire trading relationship. But percentages rarely tell the human story sitting underneath them. A lumber mill in British Columbia, an auto parts plant in Windsor, a dairy cooperative in Quebec, a hockey stick manufacturer that has shipped to American retailers for generations. For those specific industries, a 50% additional duty stacked on top of whatever they were already paying is not a rounding error. It is existential. There was one more wrinkle that made this round different from everything before it, and it goes to the heart of why so many analysts started using the phrase final red line. Because Section 338 tariffs are not time-limited, and because they explicitly override the protection that trade agreement compliance had always provided, Ottawa could no longer rely on the same playbook it had used in every previous round. Wait, negotiate a carve-out, point to compliant goods being exempt, ride out the political cycle. This time, the tariff reached goods that had, for 18 straight months, been considered safe. According to a client advisory published by the customs and trade platform ShopHappy, Trade Counsel described the move as, in effect, a negotiating position dressed up as a permanent statute. Because there is no headroom for further escalation within Section 338 itself once the 50% statutory maximum is reached. In plain terms, Washington had played its highest card in this particular deck. The 30-day countdown that followed was not quiet. It played out in hotel conference rooms and trade offices across Washington, D.C. through the second and third weeks of August. Canada's chief trade negotiator Janice Charette and Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc spent the weekend of August the 15th and 16th in Washington, following meetings the week before. On Sunday, August the 16th, LeBlanc and Charette met directly with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer. According to reporting from CP24, when Greer emerged from that Sunday meeting, he offered reporters little beyond a curt no comment, and when a journalist asked for a few words in French, he responded only with a polite bonne journée, addressed to the Radio Canada reporter present. Dominic LeBlanc, speaking to reporters shortly afterward, said simply that the two sides would continue working and that their job was not yet done. 2 days later, on Monday, August the 17th, Prime Minister Carney spoke by phone directly with President Trump. The Prime Minister's office would not release details of what was discussed, only confirming that the two leaders had covered what it described as the ongoing trade negotiations. Carney, speaking publicly that same day, called the state of talks very intense and delicate, language notably similar to how he had described the very first rounds of this dispute back in early 2025, suggesting that despite everything that had happened in between, the fundamental tension between the two governments had never really eased, only shifted shape. Then came Tuesday, August the 18th, the day the 50% tariffs were scheduled to take effect at 1 minute past midnight. According to NBC News, late that Tuesday, President Trump slammed the brakes on the wave of tariffs that had been set to hit Canada at midnight. In a statement issued that evening, Carney confirmed the postponement, saying it would last until the end of the day Friday, and repeating the now familiar formulation that substantial progress had been made while important work still remained. Trump, for his part, posted that the United States and Canada, in his words, have a deal, though he did not, at least as of the time of this recording, provide specifics on what that deal actually contains. It is worth being completely transparent here about what is and is not confirmed. The pause itself is confirmed, reported independently by NBC News, CNBC, and CP24, all citing the same underlying statements from both governments. The description of the negotiating sessions, the identities of LeBlanc, Charette, and Greer, and the general tone of intense and delicate talks, all of that is confirmed through direct quotes attributed to named officials. What is not yet confirmed, and what responsible reporting should not pretend to know, is the actual substance of whatever arrangement Trump referred to as a deal. No text of an agreement has been published, no joint statement laying out specific terms, which sectors get relief, whether the 50% Section 338 tariffs are suspended, reduced, or simply delayed pending further talks, has been made public by either government as of this recording. Carney's own choice of words, substantial progress rather than agreement reached, suggests the two sides are closer to a framework than to a finished, signed arrangement. Anyone telling you the precise contents of that deal right now is guessing, and this script is not going to pretend otherwise. So why are so many people calling Carney's handling of this moment the response that stunned Washington? Not because of any single dramatic gesture. There was no press conference table thump, no viral soundbite designed for clips. It's the pattern across 18 months that makes the framing land. Compare Carney's Ottawa to the posture Washington had grown used to from previous Canadian governments during earlier trade friction. Instead of escalating publicly, match for match, tariff for tariff, Carney's government spent 2025 quietly diversifying, deepening ties with the European Union, strengthening trade relationships with the United Kingdom, positioning Canada as the stable, predictable partner in contrast to a Washington whose tariff policy could change with a single Truth Social post. When Ontario's Reagan ad triggered Trump's fury in October, it was a provincial government's ad, not Ottawa's, and Carney's federal government neither escalated the rhetoric nor fully disowned the province. It let Doug Ford make his own call on pulling it, while keeping the federal negotiating channel technically open. When the Supreme Court handed down its ruling in February, Ottawa did not spike the football. Officials noted the practical benefit would be limited given how much Canadian trade already qualified under the existing trade agreement, an unusually sober, unglamorous assessment for a moment that could easily have been spun as total vindication. And when Section 338 arrived in July, stripping away the safety net Canadian exporters had relied on for a year and a half, Ottawa's negotiators did not walk away from the table. They kept showing up. Sunday meetings, weekend flights to Washington, a director-level negotiator and a cabinet minister working through consecutive days right up against a hard deadline. And they extracted, at minimum, a pause with days still left on the clock rather than a 50% tariff actually landing on hockey sticks and dairy trucks at the Ambassador Bridge. That is the pattern analysts point to when they describe Carney's approach as the thing that caught Washington off guard. Not defiance, but patience paired with persistence, absorbing blow after blow. 25%, then 35%, then an extra 10% over an advertisement, then a 50% sectoral strike under a never-before-used statute, without ever fully breaking off talks, and without ever fully capitulating either. A senior trade official quoted anonymously in Canadian coverage of the talks described Ottawa's strategy as refusing to be the party that blinks first, while also refusing to be the party that walks away from the table entirely. Whether that strategy produces a durable agreement by the new Friday deadline, or simply resets the clock for another round of brinkmanship, is genuinely unknown right now, and it would be dishonest to tell you otherwise. It is also worth stepping back and asking what this entire 18-month arc has actually cost both economies, because tariff percentages can start to feel abstract after the fifth or sixth escalation. According to figures tied to the Supreme Court case, the tariffs struck down in February 2026 alone were estimated to have generated more than $200 billion in revenue for the U.S. Treasury by the time the ruling landed. Revenue now potentially subject to refund claims still working their way through lower courts, with no final resolution yet in sight. On the Canadian side, Deloitte's economic forecasting, cited in Canadian business coverage, projected the country's growth would slow to around 1.5% in 2026, a figure directly tied to the drag from sustained American tariff pressure across the manufacturing and resource sectors that make up such a large share of Canadian exports. Algoma Steel, one of Canada's major steelmakers, announced plans to lay off roughly 1,000 workers late in 2025, a decision the company and Canadian officials linked directly to the tariff environment. These are not abstractions. Behind every percentage point in this story sits a payroll, a shift schedule, a family in Sault Ste. Marie or Windsor or Hamilton wondering whether their plant survives the next round of proclamations out of Washington. There is also a broader legal and constitutional dimension that will likely outlast this particular news cycle, regardless of what happens by Friday. The Supreme Court's February ruling did not just affect Canada. It affected every country hit by the emergency powers tariffs, and it set a precedent that any future president attempting to use that same statute for taxation purposes will now have to reckon with a 6-3 Supreme Court decision standing directly in the way. That is a genuinely significant guardrail on executive power, even if, in the specific case of Canada, the administration simply pivoted to different statutory tools within days. Legal scholars at the Council on Foreign Relations have noted that the ruling reopens fights over tariff refunds, over which other statutory authorities remain available to the executive branch, and over the basic stability of trade policy for companies trying to plan supply chains more than a few months into the future. Ottawa's negotiators know this. It is part of why Canadian officials have been careful in public statements, not to treat any single ruling or any single pause as a final resolution, because the legal and political ground underneath this relationship has shifted at least 4 separate times in 18 months, and there is no obvious reason to assume it has stopped shifting now. So, where does that leave things heading into the extended Friday deadline that Carney announced this week? Publicly, both sides describe momentum towards some kind of framework. Privately, according to people close to the talks cited in Canadian reporting, negotiators on both sides are described as cautiously optimistic, but unwilling to characterize anything as final until documents are actually signed. Dominic LeBlanc's own words from that Sunday outside the meeting, "Our job is not yet done," may end up being the most accurate single line to describe where this entire saga currently sits. Not resolved, not collapsed, suspended for now, somewhere in between. Before wrapping up, it's worth being fully transparent about sourcing, because a story with this many moving legal pieces deserves that scrutiny. The chronology of tariff escalations, February 2025 through August 2026, is drawn from confirmed reporting by NBC News, CNBC, CP24, CNN, ABC News, Al Jazeera, and BBC News, cross-referenced with primary legal documents including White House fact sheets and Supreme Court filings, summarized by the Congressional Research Service, the Council on Foreign Relations, and multiple trade law firms including Wiley, White, and Case, Holland and Knight, Norton Rose Fulbright, Fasken, and Blakes. The specific figures on trade volume come from the Office of the United States Trade Representative. The fentanyl seizure statistics come from U.S. Customs and Border Protection data as cited by BBC News. Economic impact estimates for Canada, including the Algoma Steel layoffs and Deloitte's growth projection, are drawn from Canadian broadcast reporting. What remains genuinely unverified, and what this script has deliberately avoided presenting as settled fact, is the specific content of whatever arrangement Trump described simply as a deal on August the 18th. Because, as of this recording, neither government has published its terms, and anyone claiming to know those terms in detail is speculating rather than reporting. Zoom out even further, and this dispute sits inside one of the oldest and deepest trading relationships on the planet. Canada and the United States share the longest international border in the world, and for decades that border was treated, by both governments, almost as a formality rather than a barrier. The original free trade agreement between the two countries dates back to 1988, later folded into the broader North American agreement that also brought in Mexico, and then updated again in 2020 into the version now commonly referred to as the USMCA or CUSMA on the Canadian side of the border. That 2020 agreement was itself negotiated during Trump's first term, and for years afterward, officials on both sides pointed to it as evidence that even contentious American administrations could reach durable working arrangements with Ottawa. Watching that same agreement get overridden outright by Section 338 in July of 2026, a statute that explicitly ignores USMCA compliance, is part of why trade lawyers describe this specific escalation differently from everything that came before it. It wasn't simply another tariff. It was the first time the actual foundation of the modern trading relationship. The agreement both governments had spent years negotiating and renegotiating stopped functioning as a shield at all. The industries caught inside that $20 billion exposure figure are worth naming individually, because aggregate numbers tend to flatten out very different stories happening on the ground. The auto sector is perhaps the most politically sensitive, concentrated heavily in Ontario, where cross-border supply chains mean a single vehicle can cross the Canada-U. Border multiple times during assembly before it's ever sold to a customer, a structure built over decades, specifically because tariffs were assumed to be a non-factor. Dairy producers in Quebec, protected historically by Canada's supply management system, found themselves at the center of the administration's discrimination claim, with Washington arguing that American dairy farmers face tighter restrictions entering the Canadian market than farmers from other countries do. Provincial liquor boards, the government-run retail networks that control alcohol sales in most Canadian provinces, became targets after several provinces pulled American wine, spirits, and beer from store shelves in earlier rounds of retaliation, a decision Washington then cited as justification for the Section 338 alcohol tariffs months later. And then there are the smaller, almost symbolically loaded categories buried in the annexes. Hockey sticks, a product about as culturally Canadian as anything gets, cement, plywood, furniture, fishing rods, even wigs and swimming pools. Categories that make clear just how broadly the drafters of these proclamations cast their net once they started writing. There's a rhythm to how this dispute has unfolded that's worth naming directly, because once you see it, you start to notice it repeating. Washington escalates, often abruptly, often tied to a specific trigger, an ad, a court filing, a provincial policy. Ottawa responds with restraint publicly while working multiple tracks privately. Direct negotiation, diversification toward other trading partners, and occasionally targeted retaliation, like the counter tariffs Canada imposed and later partially removed on you. Goods, compliant with the North American Agreement back in August of 2025. Then a deadline approaches, negotiators fly to Washington, meetings run through weekends, and at the last plausible moment, a pause or a partial deal gets announced, almost always accompanied by careful hedged language from Carney's office rather than triumphant declarations. That rhythm has now repeated across at least 4 distinct escalation cycles in 18 months, which is part of why so many analysts covering this story are reluctant to call the current pause an ending. It looks, so far, like this dispute's most consistent structural feature. It's also fair to flag where sources describe the same events with different emphasis. American administration officials have consistently framed the tariff campaign as a response to genuine unfair treatment of U.S. goods, pointing to specific provincial trade barriers on alcohol, autos, and dairy as concrete evidence. Canadian officials and much of the Canadian press have consistently framed the same campaign as disproportionate pressure, tied only loosely, if at all, to the stated justifications, particularly on the original fentanyl rationale, given how starkly the seizure statistics undercut that argument. Both framings appear verifiably in the public record. This script has tried to present the facts underlying both without adopting either government's framing as its own conclusion. What happens after Friday is still genuinely open. Maybe this is the round where a lasting framework finally gets signed, one that survives the next controversial ad, the next Truth Social post, the next Supreme Court case winding through the lower courts. Or maybe, like the ceasefire that followed the Reagan ad fight in October, or the calm that followed the Supreme Court ruling in February, this pause turns out to be one more chapter in a relationship that keeps finding new ways to nearly break and then quietly, awkwardly hold together anyway. What do you think actually happens by Friday? Does Ottawa walk away with a real, durable agreement this time? Or is this simply the 5th pause in an 18-month pattern that keeps resetting the clock without ever resolving the underlying fight? If you want to see where this goes when the new deadline hits, that's exactly the kind of fast-moving story worth staying close to. Because the terms of whatever gets signed, or doesn't, will shape prices, jobs, and supply chains on both sides of this border for years, not weeks. If this breakdown of how we got here was useful, following along means you won't miss the moment the actual terms of this deal, if there is one, finally become public. And if you've got family or work tied to the industries caught in the middle of this, auto plants, dairy co-ops, lumber mills, steelworkers, sticking around for the next update might be the difference between hearing about a change after it hits your paycheck and seeing it coming first. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back the moment there's something real to report. One last piece of context that deserves a place in this story, because it explains why Ottawa has been playing this particular hand so carefully rather than swinging back with matching force at every turn. Canada's economy is far more dependent on trade with the United States than the reverse is true for America's dependence on Canada. Roughly 3/4 of everything Canada exports crosses that single southern border, according to figures Canadian officials have cited repeatedly throughout this dispute. While for the United States, Canada represents an important but proportionally smaller share of overall American trade. That asymmetry is precisely why full-scale retaliation was never a realistic Canadian strategy, and why Carney's approach has leaned so heavily on diversification and patience rather than tit-for-tat escalation. Matching Washington tariff for tariff would have cost Canadian consumers and Canadian industry far more, proportionally, than it would have cost their American counterparts. A mathematical reality that shaped Ottawa's options long before Carney ever picked up the phone with Trump. It also helps explain the diversification push toward Europe and the United Kingdom that ran quietly underneath almost every headline in this saga. Every new trade relationship Canada builds outside North America is, in effect, an insurance policy against exactly this kind of escalation. A hedge against being economically dependent on a single trading partner whose tariff policy can shift with a signed proclamation or a late-night social media post. Whether that diversification strategy meaningfully reduces Canada's exposure within the next few years, or whether geography and existing supply chains keep the United States as the dominant trading partner regardless, is a genuinely open economic question that will likely take years, not months, to answer either way.